Hello and welcome to your first Ed puzzle. Today is the 30th of November. You didn't have a warm up, so you just had to get into the Ed puzzle. Announce for today, reminder that you guys have a 2.1 quiz on Monday, so please make sure you're reading the book. On the quiz, you can use the note catcher that you're going to do today, your lab notebook, and your notebook, so make sure those are all ready to go. But yeah, please read the book. And then today, when you leave, please make sure you thank the sub. Activities for today, this Ed puzzle, population interactions, and while you are listening to this, you are going to be filling this note catcher out. So if you didn't get one from the sub, please get one. It is 2 pages, front and back, so 4 pages. Get your name on there in case you misplace it, but you will not be turning this in. You will be just using it on the quiz. And then once you guys are done with this, and while you're doing this, I would recommend pausing the video so you have time to fill out these questions. Once you're done with that, there will be a second really short Ed puzzle. It is a Pica video that I think does a really good job of explaining one of the concepts in here, and I'll explain that during this Ed puzzle. And then once you're done with that, you will study for the quiz on Monday if you have time. So let's get into this. So for the start, we're just going to get into what is ecology. So on this front page, these notes will go in order, same order that's on your sheet here. So what is ecology? So first thing that you guys are probably already familiar with is what a species is. So it's a group of organisms sharing common characteristics that interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Hopefully this is a review from freshman year. You learned about potentially mules. So mule is a mix between a horse and a donkey. A mule can't actually reproduce. They're not fertile. So that would not be considered a example of a species, right? So species, get that definition down. You can pause this if you need to. Habitat, second definition, the environment in which a species normally lives. And there are times where we'll talk about natural habitats versus urban habitats. And some great examples are falcons can often be seen nesting on cliff sides, but they also will make homes in skyscrapers in the city. So both habitats, it's typically where it normally lives. It serves the same function for that particular species. But again, like normally is shifting for certain species. So get that definition down. Next one is niche. The role an organism plays in a community. Oftentimes, I refer to a niche as a job. And you can say niche, you can say niche, tomato, tomato, but these are physical and environmental conditions that it requires, the species requires, and the interactions it also has with other species. And that's something that some students forget about. It's not just the tree that it's in or the cliff that it lives on. It's not just the food that it eats, but it's also how does it interact with other species? And that plays a really big role when we start talking about in these notes today, species interactions. So if you have a predator, how it pushes around its prey in its habitat is a big deal. And so that interaction that it has with other species is most definitely part of its role that it plays or its niche that it has. So those take care of the first 3 sections on your note catcher. So again, make sure those are completed. And if you want to add examples, that's always a really nice way to approach this content. So on the next little bit here, we're going through some components of a niche. And again, some of this should be review, but hopefully, again, you understand that a niche is how an organism makes a living or its job. And then abiotic factors. So abiotic factors, these are non-living factors of an ecosystem, so they are not alive. So they can include how much space there is. They can also include availability of light. Some things that I didn't list here would be temperature, right? So climate, how is the climate? Is there a seasonal difference in temperature? Is there a seasonal difference in light? What are the typical pH ranges for an aquatic system? What else have we talked about before? Sometimes people can look, or oftentimes species will vary depending on the geology of the region. So any factor that is non-living that could potentially impact a species is a big deal. I'll show you a diagram on the next slide that will go through some other examples. So some biotic factors that could potentially impact a species niche is just, again, any relationship that organism may have. I mentioned predator and prey relationships, but we could go look at various relationships of species in terms of symbiosis. Is there mutualism? Is there any sort of symbiotic relationship, like with lichen between an algae and a bacteria? That's another great example. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Where it lives, so where specifically, and habitat is a great way to explain this, but also like where within a habitat. So particular beetle could potentially live on the surface of the bark, and then another beetle could actually live within the tree if it bores into a tree. That is specifically where it lives. And then how it responds to resources available, predators and to competitors. And again, when we talk about species interactions, this will make a little more sense, but those are all how an organism responds to the living components within its habitat. And then last but not least here, let me move this out of the way, how it alters these biotic factors. And there are some species that have a much bigger impact on the biotic factors. There are ecosystem engineers. You may have heard of that term. So something like a beaver, how it alters these biotic factors. They have a massive Beavers have a massive impact on what a habitat looks like. They come in, they put a dam in, it creates habitat for willows. That is a living thing that has now growing because of the interactions that that particular species, that beaver, had on the surrounding ecosystem. So that's just one example, but yes, organisms can have big impacts on biotic systems. So we're going to talk about the next thing on your list here is carrying capacity. I'm going to pause for a second and talk about niches, types of niches, and you will actually answer what the difference is between these two on the next page. So if you want to flip to the next page so you can see what the question is, feel free. But let's go through the different types of niches here. Oh, I forgot about this. So this was what I was mentioning with the abiotic and biotic factors. Here's a little visual if this ends up being more helpful to you. I pulled this from the book, but you got your biotic factors over here. You've got some examples of what could potentially be in the soil. And these are typically, again, overlooked, I would say, by a lot of students, and the impacts that they have on species and how abiotic and biotic components really play into one another. So be familiar with all these. And some of these you already were exposed to during our 2.5 subtopic, where we looked at all the different ways that you can measure an ecosystem. So familiarize yourself with this in the book if you find a visual is more helpful. Okay, so back what I was talking about with the niches and on that second page there. So on the second page, it is asking you distinguish between fundamental niche and realized niche. So fundamental niche is general, right? So we're going to use Angry Birds here. So when we're talking about angry birds, we can say they are birds. They live in a tree, right? So that is a general niche. That is what we call its fundamental niche, the full range of conditions, right? We're saying this is in general where an angry bird would be. In terms of a realized niche, that would say specifically what part of the tree is this angry bird in? So these would be actual conditions. So we would then say, okay, well, the yellow angry bird, it tends to inhabit the upper part of the tree. Red bird is typically in the middle, and then bluebird tends to stay to the trunk or the lower part of the tree. So again, general versus specific. And this comes into play when we start talking about the second Edpuzzle that you guys are going to look at with pika. So pika has a fundamental niche of high alpine. Realized niche can actually change depending on climatic factors, and you will see that in the Edpuzzle. So take a moment, distinguish between a fundamental and a realized niche. Again, examples I think would be very helpful to include in there. So let's go back to carrying capacity now. So that was on the front page. It's also number 3 here, so it's kind of split up between two of these. So, keep forgetting about these second diagrams I have. So this is a more realistic example of a niche fundamental versus realized, not angry birds, but actual organisms. So on the right here, we have the Cape May warbler, bay-breasted warbler, and yellow-rumped warbler. If you were in my bio class freshman year, I use very similar diagrams, but you can see that, again, this is actual data. These are typically where these species will live. And then again, like some students get habitat and niche confused, so I just want to put this in here. They are two different things. They're very different, so make sure you don't intermix those two definitions. Okay. So now is where I would normally in class show you this pica video, but again, that's going to be a separate Edpuzzle. So make sure you watch that because it has to do with fundamental and realized niches. So watch that after this. This is a little map of pica's dwindling habitat. So in years past, I've watched the video and then we kind of look through current conditions versus predicted outcomes of different levels of ranging of temperatures. Again, I think the video does a great job of going through this, so I'm going to skip through that. Okay, now we're on to carrying capacity. So on the front page, definition, very bottom of the front page, you have carrying capacity. So the definition I would get down would be this over here. Carrying capacity is the number of organisms that an ecosystem can sustainably support. Again, should be relatively familiar from freshman year. If you're not remembering that or your teacher didn't cover that for some reason, please take the time to read through the book and make sure you really understand this. So carrying capacity, oftentimes it's depicted in a graphical representation like this, and we're going to talk about this particular shape of graph in a little bit here, but whoops, my bad. But oftentimes it's shown as carrying capacity, and the letter that is associated with carrying capacity that I would write down in your definition, do like a little, can I draw a pen? I can't do a pen. You could just next to your definition, do little parentheses and K. And one of you asked about why is it called K-selected versus R-selected species. This is one of the reasons why. K-selected species tend to follow a population chart that looks a little more like this right here. So they're called K-selected species. And then R-selected, R stands for rate, and they have a higher rate of, or just a different graph that has a stronger rate of incline compared to K species. So anyways, sidetrack there. But make sure you understand that K also can be used instead of carrying capacity. So what I was saying was that with these graphs, oftentimes it just looks like a straight line here. Do you guys see that? In reality, I also wanted to include this graph here, is it's not always that cut and dry. Oftentimes what happens is a population will go through what's called an overshoot, which gets really uncomfortable for that species. We've seen that in this area with deer. You tend to have a situation where all of a sudden there's an explosion of deer, and there's a lot of things that go on with that, right? Decreasing O2 supply, not in case of terrestrial systems, that would be obviously more for aquatic, but low food supply, absolutely. If you have over grazers, right, if you have too many deer, not enough food, that means starvation for a lot of those deer. Disease, we had a pretty gnarly bout of wasting disease in this valley. I think it's a lot better than it used to be, but it was because we had pretty high populations. Predators, they're like, hell yeah, we're going to go after these deer. Look how many there are. Let's follow these massive herds and start picking them off. And then limited space, this tends to be an issue when it comes to mating season. We'll talk about competition, not great for species if they're competing for females to go lay not lay eggs but go have their young in a safe area. That tends to be a really difficult task, and so again, I'm just talking about deer here. That could be a really big issue. These are all considered either environmental resistance is one way to discuss those factors that play into that cap, right, this carrying capacity, that kind of point where things can be maintained sustainably. Also, limiting factors like these can also be defined as limiting factors. But yeah, those delightful lines where the graph just ends, it's not reality of what actually happens. You get this fluctuation of a population around carrying capacity. And carrying capacity can increase. That's something that if we're talking about deer again, if there was a really bad drought year, carrying capacity would then lower, right? The likelihood of a really sustainable production of grasses and their food is probably going to be a lot lower. So carrying capacity lowers. Really awesome year in terms of maybe there's less predators around. Boom, carrying capacity may have gone up a little bit. So again, fluctuations, it's not cut and dry. So just be mindful of that. So that's carrying capacity. Done with the front page. If you go to the back page, you should have done number 2. And then number 3 says, explain why population growth slows when a population approaches its carrying capacity. So you may want to pause right now, talk about that. Okay, once you're done with that, head to the next page where it says interactions. So It is saying define the following species interactions. I love this table. You learned about this freshman year, and I think the way we teach it in freshman year is a lot more, I would guess, convoluted. This is really cut and dry. So, competition. Neither species benefits, both species suffers. That is the most cut and dry way of explaining competition. Competition is I would argue, the most important interaction that we'll talk about because it is what we'll talk about in topic 2. We'll talk about in biodiversity, and we'll also talk about it when we discuss evolution. Competition is a driving factor. When both species suffer, neither species is winning. That pushes a lot of behaviors and a lot of changes within populations because of that fact that both of them are negatively impacted. Examples. I'm going to let you come up with some examples on here. I am sure that you have potentially some examples from freshman year, but talk to one another. Take the time. This class shouldn't just be you with your headphones plugged in, not talking to your peers. Talk to your peers. Hey, what do you think are some examples of competition? If you're really struggling, look it up. Look through some actual examples. Okay, that could be really helpful to ground these definitions into your head. Second little interaction here. This is in order. Predation. One species kills the other species for food. Species A, if we're calling these two different species, right? Species A, one would benefit. Species B is getting eaten. So that's not great. Examples, wild number of examples you could come up with. So go ahead and get some of those down. Parasitism, you have all been victims of parasitism, I would guess. Mosquitoes, really, really good example. Again, the parasite benefits at the cost of the host. Do you get bit by a mosquito and you were like screwed? Most of the time, no, you're fine. Other times, yeah, you're probably other times you may have just contracted malaria, or you go up to places like in Alaska or in Southeast Asia and you're covered in mosquitoes, and that is not good, right? The cost of the host, that is going to be bad. Mosquitoes, just one example. Heartworms, tapeworms, the number of worms that you can get is disgusting. I'm sure one of you has had a leech before. They're disgusting too. They tend to, again, not be great for the host animal. And again, humans, like, we are relatively well adapted to combat these parasites, but consider what a wild animal has to deal with. If you want to look up some gnarly photos, look up black bears with tapeworms. Don't do this before lunch. It is disgusting. It's gross, but look it up. All right. Last one is getting kind of cut off here. So, oh, wait, sorry. It goes into herbivory on your notes. Herbivory is essentially just animals eating plants. I didn't include that on here because it didn't seem like I wanted to kind of focus on organisms, animal organisms, not plant. But herbivory, write something down there about like what species could be considered true herbivores, meaning they are only eating plants. So write something there. Sorry, I don't have a definition in here, but I feel like you guys are probably pretty confident with that. So yeah, sorry, skipped over that one. So mutualism, last one here on your list. Both species benefit. I want to make sure I'm not cutting anything off here. Both species benefit. Excellent. So in this case, some examples of mutualism that you've probably heard of before. The classic one, and I want you to write more definition or more examples down than just this one. But the bumblebee or the bee, the honeybee, and flower, right? Or really any pollinator in a flower. The organism that is doing the pollinating is getting free food, and then the flower is is getting essentially its seed. It's its organs spread around to other flowers' organs, which is awesome. So mutualism, that's a classic example. Look up some other examples. There's some really good ones with like cattle egrets and cattle or water buffalo that you can look up, but get a couple examples down so you feel good about that. The book has a couple examples, so make sure you're reading through that. But again, you learned this pretty well in freshman year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Okay, so now we're on to the bottom of the page here. It says distinguish between intra and interspecific competition. So when we're talking about competition, one thing that I want to talk about before we talk about inter and intraspecific is this concept of the competitive exclusion principle. This is not in your notes, but there is some space underneath here or on the previous page if you want to write down what competitive exclusion principle is. I just went over this with my freshmen, so I know you guys learned this freshman year. I know other teachers taught it. It's been a while though, so let's go through this. So essentially what it's saying is no two similar species can occupy the same niche at the same time. The example that I have here is of high and low tide. So essentially what it's just showing is there's two different species of barnacles. These are barnacles that are up against rock. And it's saying that, again, like competition is negative. So these barnacles, they do not want to compete for space or food. And to avoid that, they end up occupying two different niches. And that can happen over a long period of time. So when we talk about evolution, this will pop up again. And this can also impact biodiversity. So if you have this competition occurring, you can have a small space with multiple species because they are not actually competing for the same food. They are taking they're occupying different areas of the same habitat. If you look over here, again, there's that word evolution that I keep mentioning, that we will come back and talk about this when we talk about evolution and biodiversity. But when you have competition, and we'll talk about specific in just a second, but when you have that competition, it's really not great for either species. So they tend to figure out how to avoid that competition. So competitive exclusion principle, be aware of it. Now we're on to, let's get my face out of here, interspecific and intraspecific competition. This is photoshopped, just to be clear. So intraspecific is the first one that's labeled on your document here. So let's go through that first. So intraspecific competition, that's a competition between members of the same species. And that can happen, it tends to happen a lot when you see, trying to think of a good example. Um, uh, there's tons of videos of wolves that make a kill, and then they are competing over that food, right? There's one kill, but they are kind of going after each other. God, I picked such a stupid photo. There's so many other photos I could have picked. I'm sorry. But there's wolves that are going after the same animal, and that is intraspecific, right? Or the same carcass, if you will. You can see this with vultures, another great example of like animals that would go after carrion, which is just rotting meat or a dead animal. You can also see during mating season competition between members of the same species. You see some of the fights that typically male species get in during mating season. It is gnarly. And so that would be another great example of intra-specific competition. Space can be one, especially like we watched that bear video last class. Think about the competition that was involved for that female bear, that sow bear, in order to get that cave. That was a beautiful cave or den, whatever you want to call it, outside of Durango. That is something that clearly was probably hard to get in terms of there was probably some competition there. And that would be, again, considered intra-specific competition. Get some examples down, people. Get some examples down. Inter-specific competition, on the other hand, is a more classic example, I would say, of just competition between different species. In this case, we're looking at predation right here, potentially, but you could also assume that, okay, this is a hyena, this is a lion. There was probably some competition. There was probably some prey nearby that maybe they were both going after. Hyenas tend to be scavengers, so it was also maybe a situation where that hyena went for a kill that the lion was trying to munch on. So make sure you get some examples down of interspecific competition. Again, food, space, like all those things that we listed when we talked about carrying capacity, those would be things that they are competing for, those two different species. Okay, last page here. This should also look familiar to what you've seen freshman year. So we're going through this. Population changes. So this whole back page is all about population changes. So there's no real space, again, to talk about these, I would say, this review from freshman year. Again, there's plenty of room on here in order to add this to it or add it to your own notes. But hopefully you understand that population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at the same time. We say the same time because it can change depending on various maybe rates of extinction. There could also be migration where that would change like where a population is. So yeah, get that definition down if you are not familiar with what a population is. And then population density, again, I'm just going through this with my freshmen, so I know you guys learned about this, but it's just the number of individuals within an area. It tends to be in squared, units squared. I don't know why it has inverse there, but yeah, kilometers squared. Example of gazelle, something on an even plane. Bacteria can move in 3 dimensions. And so that would be centimeters cubed. They would be grown in like a culture or something, which is 3 dimensional. So that's why you sometimes see the cubed. And then factors that affect population size, natality, meaning births. So natal, prenatal, when you hear that root word natal, it means births. So natality is births. Mortality, mortal, that's death. So mortality is deaths. And then migration. So migration is the movement of organisms in and out of an area, which can include immigration, which is organisms moving into an area, and then emigration, which is organisms moving out of an area. So immigration and emigration, I hear those interchanged all the time. They are two different things. Immigration, again, moving into an area, emigration, moving out of an area. So if you were to say there is a group of bald eagles that emigrate from Roaring Fork Valley or emigrate from Mongolia during the winter months, you would be saying they are leaving that area. So there's a little review of population. And then hopefully you've seen these types of graphs before. These are S and J shaped curves or graphs. And these are, again, pretty great names for them because this is an S shape right here, an S curve, and you can see that lovely S shape. It's a little dramatic. And then J shaped, look at that. It's a J. So this is a way to look at population graphs and based on the shape alone, figure out what is going on with these populations. And again, you can back this all back up to what we started with that lab, with the type 1, type 2, type 3 curves. This is going back to that. Slightly different structure, but you can see that the shape of a population can be pretty profound in terms of understanding what's going on with it. So with the S-shaped curve, that tends to be, there's some limiting factor. So where it says on your paper, it says outline what is represented in S and J-shaped curves, say something about like populations, right? And then you may want to include something along the lines of, well, an S-shaped curve includes carrying capacity. There is environmental resistance. This is typical, right? There is going to be some limit to food, to space. There is going to potentially be disease that strikes up. So your typical population is going to be an S-shaped growth curve. But there are instances where you see a J-shaped curve where there are no environmental conditions that are slowing them down. Currently, humans are crushing it right now in terms of population growth, which we will talk about next year. And this is what our curve looks like. Bacteria will look like this. When you first put it into a petri dish, it goes bonkers and the population spikes. Certain invasive species, and when a species has really favorable conditions, you can get this type of curve as well. But look at this over here. Before this S-shaped curve became an S-shaped curve, if we were to narrow this down, look at that. It's a J-shaped curve. So initially, most populations will show that J-shaped curve where there are no environmental constraints. And then eventually, like what would happen over here is you would get that bloop carrying capacity, which again is that point. Oh my God, I can't draw. Where you have environmental resistance. Remember, that can also be labeled K. And then back to my more realistic situation here, you would end up seeing overshoot, dieback around carrying capacity. So these are lovely, beautiful examples of graphical representations of populations. They're not always so pretty. Visuals are helpful. Get these down in your notes. Boom, boom. And that's a wrap, folks. I think that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this situation here. And yeah, please make sure that this is fully completed. Hold on to it for the quiz. Your next task is to watch the short Edpuzzle on Pica. And again, the Pica thing is going back to our fundamental and realized niche just to kind of drive that home and how it all connects here. Have a great weekend. See ya.